Order your to-go kits at sipsandstrokes.com. Today we're doing the Atlanta Strong kit. Okay, so we're starting out with our sketched canvas. You see we also have our instructions. We're going to put those over to the side. We're going to begin by mixing our blue and white for the blue section with stars. So we're going to mix 1 scoop of white with our big brush and 2 scoops of blue. Notice we're mixing really big scoops. I'm going to mix that all together. Don't worry if it's completely mixed. It's totally fine. We're going to do some blending anyway. So we're going to start painting our section that's going to be a background for our stars. So we're doing back and forth strokes here. Long, soft paint strokes work best. Just hold your brush loosely here so that you're not trying to get perfect strokes. It doesn't matter if you go outside the pencil marks a little, you're supposed to. Later on, when we're adding our other colors in, we're going to have those kind of go over on top of this blue a little bit, just so it looks like they're fading into each other. This is a nice rustic flag. So we're just painting with that blue and white mixture here. If you ever run out of colors, just mix it again. Doesn't matter if it's exactly the same, especially if you're going to be doing some blending. And if you go outside the lines here, it does not matter a bit. These are just kind of sketchy lines to guide you. So we're going to start blending a little bit of blue in. Now when you blend colors, you have to make sure the color you're blending into is still wet. So we couldn't wait a long time if we wanted this to blend. We wanted to make sure we blended it while the paint's still wet. So now we're going to make some clouds. When you make clouds, and we'll do a little demo on this in a few minutes, you just take your finger, put a tiny bit of white paint on, and then just make your clouds in a line and then go above and below the line a little bit. And again, we're going to show you in just a second kind of more detail on how to do this. But notice the clouds are not perfect. We're just doing that with our fingers. That's the easiest way to make clouds is with your fingers. Okay, so let's slow it down and do a little cloud tutorial here. We've got a little bit of blue paint on the finger. We're just going to do a little line of blue, kind of back and forth, round and round. And notice we went above that line a little bit, and now we'll also go, above and below the line a little bit. And we can keep playing around with this, going back and going really softly around and around until we have a nice fluffy cloud. While we still have our blue and white mixture, we're going to go ahead and paint the sides of our canvas. You always want to make sure anything that goes to the edge of the canvas that you wrap it around the side. Okay, and the next step, we're going to do our red stripes in just a second. We're going to mix with our big brush 3 big scoops of red and a little scoop of black. We're going to mix those together to make the base coat for our red stripes. Now this is just a base coat. Don't worry that it's really, really dark. We will be going back over that later on with 2 other colors. So we're going to do nice, long, soft paint strokes here. Notice we're not respecting the boundaries of the pencil marks here. We are just letting this red just kind of disappear into the blue. This is a nice rustic looking flag background. So we don't want everything to have nice crisp lines. We want it to kind of all flow together. So nice, long, soft paint strokes. You'll notice as you start getting closer towards the buildings that you're going to have to kind of dodge those buildings some. Do not worry if you run into the buildings. That's totally fine. We're actually going to paint these buildings black later, so it doesn't matter. Do not worry at all if you run into these. If you didn't run into them, I'd be nervous because it would mean you're not going close enough. If you'd like to switch to your medium brush in this area, feel free to do so. You're hearing Guido, my cockatiel, in the background. There are so many benefits to working from home. This is not one of them. But again, you can switch to your medium brush to do these little areas. right in between the buildings. Again, we will come back in later on, paint those buildings black, so it doesn't matter at all that we've run into them. You can go ahead and wrap that red, that deep red color around the sides as well. Okay, so we're going to start painting our white stripes. We're going to have a little bit of that honey mustard looking color on our small brush and then white on our big brush. So we're going to just put a few little dabs of the honey mustard color into the stripe area, and then with the white paint on our big brush, we're going to softly blend that in. We just went into the red stripe here, but don't worry about that. Later on, we are going to go back over that area, so we'll take care of it. I'm going to wipe a little bit of it off there. So we're going to do each of our stripes this way. When we get more towards the buildings, we will start making it a little bit darker just to make it look more like a sunset. But for right now, we're taking our small brush and adding little dabs of the honey mustard color in, and then coming back over that while it's still wet with our big brush, which is loaded down with white paint. So we're going to softly blend that white and raw sienna there together. Again, we're giving this kind of a rustic look. We're going to continue this pattern all the way down to the buildings. While we're up in this area that's a little bigger, we are still able to do those long, soft paint strokes. But when you get into the smaller areas, obviously this becomes a little more difficult to do. So feel free to switch to that medium brush to add the white paint in those smaller areas. We'll still continue adding that honey mustard color with the small brush so we don't get too much in there. And notice again, we are running right into this blue with this white and honey mustard mixture. Adding a little more honey mustard down here, and then coming back in with our white and just really softly blending. You will run into your buildings again when you're doing this, but like we said before, we will be coming back in later and adding some black to these buildings, so do not worry about that. We've also run into our deep red stripes in some areas with this color, but that doesn't matter. Again, all just trying to get some paint on the canvas so that later on when we come back in, we can really make those red stripes pop. We're going to build some depth. That's why we did this deeper red color to begin with, and we'll come back in and lighten it up some later on. So in these little areas we're pointing out here, we are going to switch to our medium brush for our white paint. We're still using the small brush for the honey mustard. Just putting little dabs here and there. Don't worry if you accidentally do a section that shouldn't be done with this. Sometimes we run into the buildings, but just remember later on we are going to come back in and paint those buildings, so it does not matter. Make sure you're going all the way up to that deep red color. Notice we're kind of overlapping the deep red in some places. That's completely fine. This background again is very rustic. And don't get over eager in this area and try to do all the honey mustard and then come back and blend it. Do little sections at a time, because the number one rule of blending is you cannot blend into dry paint. So we want to make sure we're doing little sections at a time here so that that honey mustard doesn't have a chance to dry before we add the white to the top of it. So making sure we get all these little sections in between the buildings. Now obviously these buildings are just kind of abstract here, so if you have to make some of them bigger later on in order to come up or to cover up sections that you might not have hit with these colors, that's totally fine. Don't worry about that. I'm going to go back in and add a little more of that honey mustard color just to make it look like there's little darker colors down at the bottom, so we have that sun setting over our buildings. Now we're going to come back in and add some red to those deep red stripes. And the next thing we're going to do here, this is going to give that red a little pop here. You'll still be able to see some of the deep red underneath. That's perfect. Our whole idea here is, in addition to making it look a little rustic, we want to give it some depth. And in order to have depth, you've still got to see that red, that deep red color underneath a little bit. So we're just coming in and softly adding some of that straight red to all the areas where we did the deep red earlier. Just went outside the lines a little bit into that kind of beige color, but that's totally fine. We will be coming back later and adding some highlights and accents and outlining around all of our stripes, so this is not going to be an issue at all. We're going to continue this all the way down as far as that deep red goes, right into where our buildings are. You know, you never realize how noisy your family is until you try to go in and do audio over a video. So if you're hearing sandwiches being made in the background, my dog noisily eating in the background, please excuse those noises. You guys are probably going through the same things at your house. Okay, so this red again, we're going to do this straight red on top of this deep red all the way into those buildings. Let's wrap a little bit of that around the sides as well. And remember, we will come back in later on and do some things that'll kind of clean up around those stripes. Notice here we've got lots of areas where we've run into our buildings. Want to show you that we do that as well, don't worry. So we're going to take some of this blue and white mixture we have from before and use our small brush to come in and just do some little highlights on these red lines and also kind of outside them a little on the beige areas we have here. This is just to add some of this blue on the right hand side, just to bring these colors a little more together. So again, this is that blue and white mixture we had from before, using our small brush, just coming in and kind of doing some highlights and some almost outlining, except we're not trying to be perfectly on the line here. Makes it look a little more rustic and not quite as planned. Okay, so we're getting ready to start these black buildings now. We will be covering up some of those lines that we had earlier when we ran into the buildings. We're going to start at the top of the buildings here and work our way down. If you need to use your medium brush at the top of the buildings in order to get into some of the smaller spaces, feel free to do so. But once you get down to the bottom area where you've got a lot of room, just switch to that big brush. It's just a little easier to get nice full coverage when we're using our big brush. But again, you can use that medium brush up towards the top in order to stay in the lines a little better. We will be doing some outlining around this later on, so if those lines get to the point where they're really not very straight, it does not matter. When you're using the flat brushes, it is a little easier to get straight lines though. So you don't want to try to use that small brush for these tiny areas. We do want to stick with our medium brush and our big brush because those are our flat brushes. So we're just going to work our way across the canvas here with our black paint. And again, once we get to the area at the bottom, we will be able to switch to our big brush, which will make this process go a lot faster. Speaking of going a lot faster, know that you can go back in later on in any areas that you need to look at again. That's the beauty of having these tutorials recorded. That way you can go back in later on, and if you need to look at a particular section again, you can. Obviously, doing these black buildings, you're not going to need a lot of help with that. And don't worry, whenever you're painting with black, when the black starts to dry, you will see later on a little bit of white canvas peeking through. Don't worry about that. It's not anything you're doing wrong. It's just the way the black paint and the white canvas, they're just so stark in their differences that you are going to see a little bit of that white peeking through later on. In this case, it doesn't really matter because we're going to be adding some of that nice metallic copper as a highlight color on these buildings. Once again, this is a sunset painting. That metallic copper is going to give us the illusion that we've got some highlights and some reflections going on these buildings. So we'll switch to the big brush and we'll speed this process up a little bit, getting this black coverage down at the bottom. So for this next step, we're going to use the wooden handle of our brush to add stars. The easiest way to do little dots like we're going to use for our stars here is to use the wooden handle of that brush. We're using the wooden handle of our big brush for these stars. Notice that the stars get smaller and fade out a little as the paint kind of gets used up on the end. That's perfect. That's what makes it look like some of our stars are closer and some are farther away. It also makes some of our stars look a lot bigger than others, which is perfect. So again, we are using the wooden handle of our big brush. A lot of people try to use the small brush and use the bristles, but honestly, even that small brush, those bristles are going to be a little too big for our stars. So you can add as many or as few stars as you like to the sky. Make sure some of the stars go over the red and our beige color a little. Now we're going to start highlighting the black area with copper. So we're going to use our big brush, use nice, long, soft paint strokes. Make sure your black is dry before you start this. So you might need to pause to let that dry. But notice this shimmer we're getting from this metallic copper. The metallic colors are really nice. You always want to make sure you have a base coat for metallic colors. Otherwise, the metallics, because they're so thin, they're not going to give you very good coverage on the canvas. Same thing with any fluorescent colors you might use for any of our kits. You want to make sure you either have a base coat or you're mixing them with white. Now, so we're going to put a good bit of copper on these buildings. Don't get too generous with that copper though. Copper is a really cool color and it gives you that shimmer, so we all love it, and we all tend to go a little heavy with that sometimes. We do want to still see some of the black. If that copper does not have any of the black to contrast with, it's not going to give you as much of a punch or a nice effect as it will if it has some of that black. We're also going to add some of that metallic copper to our red and metallic copper. That's going to give us yet another layer of depth to these red stripes that we have. So we can still see a little bit of our straight red underneath this copper. We can still see a little bit of that deep red underneath the straight red. So we've got 3 different colors now for our red stripes, and that's really starting to take shape. We talk a lot about depth in these classes. We want to make sure nothing looks flat. Okay, so we're going to start our outlining now. When we outline, don't try to be exactly on the lines. We're going to use our small brush and do some haphazard outlining here. When we say haphazard, all we mean is that you don't need to be exactly on the line. You'll be on the line in some places, in the line in some places, outside the line in some places. That is absolutely perfect. You want this to look really, really haphazard. This is a real haphazard painting anyway, so if you come in and try to trace these lines, it's not going to have a good flow for the painting as a whole. So the only areas we're really worried about outlining are the buildings down here at the bottom. And notice again, we are not going all the way around these buildings. We're just doing just enough outlining to give us some definition. That's all outlining is just a means for us to get some definition to our painting. Okay, and that is going to wrap this one up. We are finished with this one. We hope you enjoyed this and that you will visit our website at sipsandstrokes.com to order more kits. We have different kits available every week. We are working on being able to ship our kits, so please stay tuned on that. Thank you very much.